Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support. Welcome. Today's Wednesday, July 8th. This is the InfoMullet Live Ask Me Anything. I'm your Chief Mulleteer, Timothy Clancy, and this, if you can see him, is my emotional support donkey, Bonky. If you can't see him, he's there in spirit or sneaking up behind you with a knife in his teeth. Who knows? We got a lot going on today. It's kind of an international flavor, trying to do a world update. I know a lot of people want to hear about what's going on in the US, but there's the rest of the world out there as well. So we're trying to do a balance. I'm going to have some US things later on about economics and also this discussion of state opening and closing. But I really wanted to start out, first of all, with a look at what's going on in the rest of the world. And to do that, we've talked about, from COVID-19 perspective, we talked about the world's really beginning to take shape into two different emerging worlds. It's sort of like the tale of two worlds. Those countries that are doing well with COVID-19, well is relative here. You may still have had a high death rate, but your infections are under control, your curve is decreasing. They're largely in the hammer and the dance phase. It's not that it's easy. Australia just yesterday shut down a major border between two of its most populous provinces. It's had cities that are shut down. That's the part of the hammer and the dance. If you have gotten your infections under control, but they temporarily increase, then you do go back from the dance to the hammer, but you can control where you're doing it because you have control. Having that control is key. And the US does not have that control. We are in an uncontrolled outbreak at this point. And I think, from a mathematical standpoint, you might even say it's uncontrollable from a functional perspective, absent very severe. But we're not alone in this. The Nubier 7 is a group of countries that I identified way back in March that would likely meet or exceed the US difficulties that I was actually predicting in March, that the US would have a hard time with this. That's kind of unfortunate, but sort of just the nature of forecasting. The Nubier 7 are Nigeria, Ukraine, Brazil, Bangladesh, India, Egypt, and Russia. And each one of these countries, because of a mix of they're all large population countries. None of these are very small countries. Some of them are larger than the US by quite a bit, like India. Some of them are close in size to the US, like Bangladesh, I think is maybe half the size, 2/3 of the size, Brazil. But they're all very large countries. They all have less resources for the most part than the US for dealing with this. So that's going to be a challenge for healthcare responses, testing access. They have mixed governments, mix of authoritarian regimes, and some of them have local conditions that make it hard to handle a pandemic. You have continuing persistent insurgency difficulties in Nigeria. You have an economic situation in India and Bangladesh where it may not be feasible to shut down and do a hammer and dance. The hammer itself may cause more livelihood problems. Here it's an economic hardship. There it may be an actual life ability to sustain themselves, given the large worker population. So I wanted to go through, though, and show where we're at relative to the Nubier 7, because they have in the last month really caught up to the US. There are some that are doing better than expected, and that's a good news. We'll talk about those, but they really have sort of reached up to where the US is at. And so this is the first chart. Let me get this sized a little bit here. There we go. So this is actually, and the United States is going to be brown for reference on these charts. So you see we're still at the top, right? Yay, #1, winning. And again, this is the InfoMullet chart. All these charts are up there at the InfoMullet. You can do this yourself. Jerry and the Mulleteer Data Science team has done a great job. You can pull and compare, but I pulled some comparisons. The United States is in brown. Nigeria is in green here. Ukraine is, which one is Ukraine? The dark blue, you can see where it's there. And then Brazil and Bangladesh. And again, it's a logarithmic scale. So this breakout range that we established very early in March, as this was the risk range of, crossing it would be over 1,000 cases. Well, all of these countries in this first half of the Nubier 7 have crossed this. We've so that it's a little bit easier to read, we've adjusted the time scale of these. Rather than being from the start of the outbreak, we're now doing a rolling 90 days. But you can see here how really the US is in, we're at 2.9 million cases as of the 7th, earlier or yesterday. But Brazil is already at 1.6 million. So it's really been catching up over the last 90 days. And in a large part, that's due to President Bolsonaro and the populist regime. They've been through 3 or 4 health ministers. They've had the same kind of conflicts that the US has had about taking it seriously or not. Just 2 days ago, the president finally came down with COVID-19. He's been tested 4 times with serious concerns about infection, and he just tested positive for COVID-19. So Brazil is probably, if you think about time horizons, in worse shape than the US, given its current resource standpoint, its rate of growth, and what they're even worse off in terms of reaction. And we'll go into the death rate here a little bit. But what's going to be interesting is now you have the head of state of Brazil has caught COVID-19 itself. This would be the equivalent of President Trump catching COVID. Throughout the crisis, he said, I'm an athlete, I'm going to be immune. If it's not going to be a big deal. We're now in a window where probably for most COVID cases, 5 to 9 days is when the crash happens. That's still a couple days out from the president, Bolsonaro, in Brazil. It's going to be interesting to see if he can maintain this visual appearance and this kind of, hey, everything's fine, or whether he's going to be more like Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. When he got sick, he was hospitalized, and that really served as a wake-up call. I'm afraid it's a little bit too late for Brazil. It's, there's a point at which you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And that's probably where we are for most of the Nubier countries. One of the ones that is performing, like Bangladesh and India, I'll show in a little bit here, their growth rate is just off the charts. So even though their total numbers are much, much less, almost a tenth less, you have to put those numbers in context of where their testing ability is. But Ukraine and Nigeria are both doing fairly well. And I don't think this is necessarily just because they aren't testing, like may be the case in Bangladesh. Nigeria has prior experience with Ebola. They took the pandemic very, very seriously. So despite an initial forecast of, hey, this is a country in Africa that's probably going to struggle, they're doing better than any of the Nubier 7. So Nigeria has sort of shown that even though it's not by any means easy or good what they're dealing with now, they are able to handle it. Ukraine has also done fairly well. The back half of the Nubier, well, look at it this way. So this is the death rates now of those same countries, the crude fatality rate over time. And what you see is about what you'd expect. It's kind of a mix here. I suspect here in Nigeria, it's got a fairly low death rate. Ukraine is also fairly low. That makes sense. Bangladesh is this weird behavior where it dropped from 6% down to 1%. I don't trust that data. I don't think it's accurate. There's lots of reporting now that Bangladesh simply isn't counting COVID-19 deaths. So I think that's a little bit false. But you can see here, both the Brazil and the US have had this rise and fall in the crude fatality rate, but they're still both over 4%. Brazil is hovering right now at about 4%, the US at 4.4, and that's on a million something people. That's a high crude fatality rate to have when you've got so many people infected in your country. It's, even if it went down to 1%, that's a high amount. For comparing the back half of this, again, United States is the baseline, and then we added India, Egypt, and Russia. So you can see here that Russia was worse for a long time, but India has just caught up and crossed, and you'll see why, because India's growth is just a classic exponential growth curve. That's not saying that Russia's doing well. Russia's about 700,000, and they're much smaller than India by population wise. And Egypt is its reporting here is very low, but if I were to describe Egypt's pandemic response, it would literally be shoot the messenger. President Sisi has done everything he can to basically fire, arrest, intimidate anyone reporting on the coronavirus outbreak. So I suspect these numbers are very, very low, and will probably, if we got a more accurate accounting, it would be much higher than that. So here's the crude death rate for the Nubier. Again, you have in Egypt, you have a high rate that decreased and is now increasing back up. Russia and India are both fairly low. I think that's probably more reflective of underreporting than it is an accurate amount. Again, counting these cases is difficult, but I suspect it's going to be closer to 4%. I did want to show from a more global perspective. So this is a neat tool that just came out. The link of this is in the discussion. And this is a global dashboard put together by the Vienna Complexity Institute. So these are the, the community I work with. So I was asked last night, I don't correspond with pandemic epidemiologist folks. I don't work with like the CDC or the World Health Organization. My corresponding networks are complexity scientists, system scientists. So folks at like Santa Fe Institute, Sandia National Labs, the Vienna Complexity Institute. And so there's different perspectives on how you track pandemics, whether you're looking at it as a system or as a disease or infection. And I think we may get into this more, but this is put out by the Vienna Complexity Institute. It's a neat little app, neat in that it's informative, not neat in what it's showing, and that it has every country and it tracks the per capita positive testing rate for the last 14 days. So you can see here, it's per 10,000. So all of these countries are color coded by a population adjusted number. That's a big thing. People go, well, what about populations are different? And there's been a debate about, is Canada, is the US really more scary than Canada when you adjust for population? Yes, we are scarier than Canada when you adjust for population. Red, like literally the professor from Vienna who put this out, there's a quote from him saying, I'd feel fine traveling to green countries. I'd be a little nervous going to yellow countries, and no way in hell would I go to a red country. So you can see here, these two worlds that I described as emerging is you have the countries in green that have controlled or are controlling their outbreaks. The countries in red have lost control or don't appear to be controlling at all. And then the ones in yellows are mixed. And you can hover over each country and see where they're at. So for example, let's go up to Sweden here. This is what Sweden looks like over the last 14 days. And you can look at that behavior mode of tested positive and see kind of how they're doing. And this is why I'm able to say things like India is going to probably surpass Russia in cases pretty soon, because when we go over to India, it's almost a perfect exponential curve in growth up. So the testing rate, they're not going to be able to keep up with the testing, but you can even see where they're doing. It's an almost perfect increase. So it's even though, this is where you can see a yellow country that may end up becoming red very soon. And Brazil, we talked about Brazil. Again, it has that high increase. So if you look at this country, look at the yellows and the reds, and so compare it to United Kingdom, right? United Kingdom was not doing well by any measure, but you look at their testing rate and it has that nice decline that marks a wave one conclusion. It's got that up and down behavior. So yeah, people comparing Canada to the US, I got in this debate this morning on a Facebook page, the US behavior mode, this is that double hump, right? It had the hump that began a decline into April, May, and then has just shot up as we reopened in late May, and we're fully open by late May, early June. Canada has a increase in decline. So if you start thinking about where are we at, not just now, but where will we be in 2 weeks, Canada, barring some change, will likely shift to green. You can see it's heading down to green there, and because they're controlling it. The US is continuing to accelerate. There's no indication that the US has even stabilized its upwards growth versus decreasing it. So, I mean, you can use these charts and these tools to look at where things are going. It's unlikely that the US would go from rising up to nicely down in a week. And it gives you an indication, again, you can begin to see the world breaking out into these two worlds. The Europe, which is largely contained, and most of these are going to probably go pretty green pretty quickly. You can see here Ukraine, one of my Nubier 7. It does have a challenge, but it's also sitting next to Russia. But Europe is going to be one of these worlds. Most of Africa is doing much better because of perhaps that past pandemic experience. Asia, East Asia, for the most part, has it under control, along with New Zealand, Australia. And the other world is the world that's still struggling. This is the United States, much of South America, parts of like Russia, for example. The Middle East is very much in the second world where it's still struggling. Iran has had a double hump formation, just like the US. Saudi Arabia, Oman, all these areas are sort of tricky. And we were joking this morning when we were looking at, this is a map of where you don't want to travel and where you can't travel if you're from the US, because most of these places are not going to want folks from those red countries coming in to theirs without some sort of quarantine or something like that. So expect travel restrictions and things like that. First of all, let me say some welcomes. Rory, Todd, Mark, Ishmael, thank you, everyone. go through some of these comments here. Heather, welcome. Let's see. Yeah, so there's somebody, oh, someone left an advertisement for, let's go ahead and, if you haven't seen the advertisement to cure your life and restore broken marriages and relationships, I'm sorry, but I just removed it. I guess I'm censoring now. But I'm glad to know I've made the point of Infomullet where I have spammers come and advertise how to restore their marriage and broken relationships. Yeah, Lucas, in terms of the pandemic, I talked about this. Lucas is making fun of when I talked about the United States being a third world country now. Everything that is, when we talk about a globalized world, previously that was based off the free trade concept, right? I arrange my supply chain, I travel for tourism, I do all these economic conditions based on the concept of free trade. That was the predominant paradigm probably since China began liberalizing its markets in the 1990s. You could say the last 30 years globally, even before that in Europe. We had a sharp shift in the last 3 months where it's now COVID free trade. And you're going to see these regional trading blocks begin reorganizing themselves with supply partners and supply chains and tourist destinations and all these things based on who's handled the pandemic and who's not. Now, how long that lasts depends on how long a country is unreliable as a partner for controlling its outbreak. The United States has a completely uncontained wildfire of an outbreak right now. Brazil's the same. I don't think that's going to change over the summer. The longer it goes on, the more solid these new global patterns. Now, maybe 5 years from now, things kind of revert, but we are forming the next couple years of global trade in these months of inaction, and it doesn't look good for where the U.S. is relative to other countries. But also on the international front, we've had a couple developments last week. Last week, I was asked about Ethiopia. There's been some violence there and instability. So I wanted to go from sort of a broad view to a more narrow view with a few countries and international items that are concerned. So Ethiopia, for those who don't know Ethiopia, the sort of the historical context, Ethiopia is one of the few countries in Africa that persisted and maintained its own independent government and structure through most of the colonial period. So if you think about Ethiopian history, there's really three large governmental periods. You've got the Ethiopian Empire, also known as the Abyssinian Empire, which is really from the 13th century all the way through the 1970s. Now, there was some Italian meddling in there. Mussolini famously tried to invade it, and it didn't go nearly as well as he thought he did. But there was certainly some colonial influencing in the middle of the 20th century. But then there was a communist government in the 1970s called the Derg. And this was a military junta, basically a communist military junta that took out from 1974 to what was it? Probably around 1980s, late 1980s. I want to say 1988 or something like that. And then the current government of Ethiopia took power after them with kind of a revolutionary democratic front. And Ethiopia's government system has gotten high marks for election transparency. So it's kind of at odds. Unfortunately, people like to stereotype African countries. There's 7 huge regions in Africa, each of which is their own distinct region. You've got the northern Saharan, you've got sub-Saharan, you've got the arboreal regions, you've got the Horn, but even within those regions, there's a lot of variation. And I think one of the things with Ethiopia that's key to keep in mind is that from an election standpoint, from a government standpoint, they tend to get higher marks. But throughout that entire history I just mentioned, from the 13th century all the way through all those 3 governments, the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, called the Oromo, have been sort of a persecuted majority. And this is one of those situations where a minority population gains power and controls power. So in a lot of cases, we're used to countries where a minority population is the more vulnerable one. But in Ethiopia, it's the majority population, the Oromo, who have sort of suffered. And because of that, there's a lot of revolutionary movements, a lot of militia movements. And really the Oromo, when the elections sort of the sort of this new regime came in power in 1987, it was much more democratic than in the past. But in 2005, you had it was one of the very disputed elections, and you ended up having a situation where the governing power at the time did not want the Oromo to gain as much power as they were apparently going to, and you had massive violence, and basically within a period of months, almost 800 people I think died, or maybe it was closer to 300 people died and several thousand were injured. It was is a big burst of instability. But right alongside that, the government arrested basically 20,000 Oromo political leaders, and in a stroke, the Oromo political movement that had been sort of growing and representing and seeking to redress this long historical inequity got wiped out. So the legal and legitimate political mechanisms of the Oromo got eliminated in 2005. And since then, you've had radical movements, revolutionary movements, militia movements, all trying to express grievances for the Oromo to various degrees. And you've had protests related to these tensions in 2016, 2019. The trick is that each one of these has had this outburst of violence that's happened, has had a couple hundred people die. It's had many more in prison, and the Oromo are sort of struggling for their voice. And that sets the context of what happened last week. There was an Oromo singer, a very popular singer. Right now, the Oromos, if you get a feeling for it, they're about 35% of the population, 25 million. That's the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia. They make up the biggest region with the largest area by population and land size, and they're actually, the Oromo stretch outside of Ethiopia too. They're one of the fifth largest in the entire continent. But inside Ethiopia, they're still in this sort of suppressed state where they don't have the access to. And this singer who was killed was a protest singer, was very popular with the Oromo youth. And when he was assassinated, a whole burst of violence broke out. And this violence was multi-directional. For the most part, you've got, for the most part, it would probably be, I'd say, the police and the military forces did most of the killing. Probably 75% of the 300 or so. I think there was, as of this morning, there were 278 people killed in just a week. Most of that was done by security forces. So again, the government is trying to suppress the Oromo from speaking. So there's a long-standing history. Now, the Oromo now have positions. They actually hold, I think it's the prime minister. They have one of the highest positions, but it goes to show how the police and the military, at least in certain countries, I wouldn't at all say anything related to the United States, but the police and the military don't necessarily report to the national government. And there's been this violence that's gone on for this week. I mean, even the funeral of the singer itself, there's a huge military garrison presence at the funeral, which sort of suppressed, but it hasn't stopped the protests. These have been going on now for a week. And it speaks to this kind of roiling instability that traces back to 2005 and wiping out. If you wipe out someone's legitimate means of expression, you don't stop the problem, you just drive it underground and set the conditions for this kind of serial so let me go back and check questions. Hey, Barbara, good to see you. Mick, the freer or rather less top-down control, the more difficult the pandemic is to manage. Brazil and America are very open and free. Yeah, Mick, that's not true. That's not true at all. Germany's a pretty free country, I'd say. And I mean, Norway is a pretty free country. I think that's kind of excuse making. Like we don't need to go to really abstract. And this is, I get on the left and the right for doing this. They try and make pageants of why the pandemic isn't working. It's because of our culture. No, we're struggling at the pandemic because we botched the testing rollout at first with the CDC. It was a miserable rollout of testing. We have a national leadership that is completely absent and isn't exerting. We had a pandemic plan that was supposed to be run by the CDC through Health and Human Services, and that got tossed to put in charge FEMA under Department of Health or Homeland Security, who had no experience with this. And at every stage, when we've had a choice for whether we're going to do a national approach or not, we've sort of waived that responsibility. That puts it down in the state level, and the state responses haven't been much better. So it's kind of, I think, this trying to blame culture. The reason that Brazil and the United States struggle is they both have populist governments that don't take this seriously and tried to neg the pandemic. You go back and look at, February, March, it wasn't that people saying, oh, we're freer, therefore we'll do better in the pandemic. They're saying, oh, it's not as bad as the flu. Oh, hot weather will stop it. I mean, I don't know where you're at, Mick, but it's pretty hot where I am, and cases are still going through. So there was a lot of bad assumptions, a lot of ignoring of the science, a lot of bad policy decisions. That's why the pandemic response has struggled, not this meta morality narrative of, well, freer societies are going to struggle. That's not true at all. It has to do with pandemic. And if you looked last week, I was railing on the folks on the other side who are like socialized countries or countries with socialized medicine fared better. That's not true either. People trying to project a meta narrative on the pandemic that isn't rooted and anchored in pandemic responses are going to miss the mark in any of those arguments they offer. So yeah, I don't agree that it's some, whether it's free or not. Yep. So so that was Ethiopia. Quick sidebar on whether or not it has to do with cultural freedoms or anything like that. Yeah, it is hot in South Carolina. I can only imagine. It's basically living in the South for a bunch of time. My theory was by the time Memorial Day comes around, it's don't be outside anymore. It's just miserably hot. Yeah, and some countries, this is the other thing. Some countries that are normally very competent completely flubbed it because they picked the wrong pandemic response. I said this last week. It was, which pandemic response did you pick? When did you implement it? How effective were you implementing it? And because keep in mind, Singapore was like, oh, they're so competent, they're so great. They picked the right approach. They picked the for them, they did the panopticon, much like South Korea. So good job, pick the right one up front. They were very effective in it right up until the point where they forgot to check a lot of the neighborhoods that were sort of the day laborer workforce of the migrant worker communities, and then it spread within that. So it's really gets to not just competence at a point in time, but sustained competence over time. And you can look at Australia, for example. Obviously, Australia is benefiting; it's an island, but so is Singapore, right? So are the Philippines. There's plenty of examples of any criteria someone wants to say is this is why. There's examples of good responses and bad responses, and the data is out there. And I think you could use that map, so you can use that map to check it out. But let's continue the international roundtable. Last week, Putin got a new constitution. And I say Putin because it was really Putin's constitution. It was really the Russian constitution got amended, but it was pretty much Putin's constitution. So, you know, for general context, with the fall of the Soviet Union, you had the Russian Federation stood up and has had the same constitution amended multiple times. There's been 3 major amendments, all of them sort of trying to grapple with this concept of, to what extent are we, you know, we call it a republic, a democracy, a federation, versus an authoritarian single man rule. And pretty much every single one you can chart. I think it was like the late 90s, 2005, and then a couple ones more recently, has been on a general trend of reducing autonomy, freedoms, control of parliament, and strengthening the strong man in the regime, which has right now been Putin. So what is the Russian constitution now? What were the amendments putting it? It really comes down to 4 things that were emphasized in this constitution. One is continuismo. The other was sort of a nativist approach. The third was reducing parliament's power, and the first were some sort of teasers. So the ostensibly, at least, this constitution still needs to be passed by plebiscite. It still needs to go to a vote. It needs to get votes. So there were 3 things that were designed to sort of increase the power of the presidency, and a 4th bucket that was designed to sort of entice voters, I guess. And so let's walk through them. The phrase continuismo actually comes from Latin America. It's the concept of a governmental or civilian or military leader who refuses to step down when their time is due. And it means, its translation is continuance or continuing, right? It's the concept of a single leader who refuses to yield power. And it's a real problem for democracies and republics, because as their terms go on longer, these executive heads of state get more and more power. They accumulate more and more strings of control. If you don't cut that off, they eventually don't want to leave, and then you got to wait till they die, and you end up in a situation like in Latin America or some of these African countries where you have a 90-year-old dictator everyone's just waiting to die. And as I've said before, there is no one who lives longer in the world than a dictator you hope dies of old age. Those guys live forever. A counterexample to continuismo is George Washington, a very famous counterexample. He could have held power. There was nothing prohibiting him from going to a 3rd term. He probably would have run. But by surrendering after the second term, he really created an informal tradition of not going for continuismo. You serve your terms, you do your 2 terms, you step back. FDR obviously served 3 terms, and that caused a lot of concerns that we were reaching a continuismo. We passed an amendment which now limits presidential terms for 2 terms. This is why no matter who recommends it, I always get itchy when someone says, hey, let's have a 3rd term. Like, nope, 2 terms and you're out for president. Continuismo in Russia is very much about keeping Putin in power. So the first thing they did is they removed an in a row clause. There was basically saying you can't have so many presidential terms in a row, because before Putin, there was a provision that you couldn't have so many presidential terms in a row. So Putin was in power, and then Medvedev took over, but Putin was still the puppet master. And then after that, Putin came back in. They just did away with that. Now you can keep going. Doesn't matter if it's all in a row. They also, if that wasn't enough, they nullified the previous terms both Vladimir Putin and former President Dmitry Medvedev have served. So in a way, they said, oh, those previous terms, mulligan, those don't count for counting purposes. And they both can now serve their first term. These guys have been pretty much, Putin's been in power since the 2000s, but Medvedev did his turn for a couple years there. Both of these folks can run for their first term in 2024, and under the current structure now with the newly amended constitution, they can basically stay in power till 2036. Well, if you're looking at Putin age, he's going to be 83 years old at 2036. And this is the classic case of continuismo, maneuvering the constitution so they can stay in power. Another change is sort of a nativist change where they put in a lot of language about you can never have been a foreign resident or for a foreign citizenship. That's not unusual. That's kind of like the US. You can't be president if you were foreign born. They also added even if you renounce former residence or citizenships, this is kind of a hedge against some of the oligarchs who have had split residencies, split citizenships because of economic reasons in the 90s. They basically got citizenship in a European country, but now they're going to be forbidden from holding power. That's really the only threat to holding president. I mean, besides a revolution, which is unlikely right now. But the main threat to Putin's power is the oligarchs. This is, again, further designed to sort of do that. They reduced Parlin's power. The current and former presidents are now effectively immune from prosecution, which we kind of knew informally, but has now been formalized. The law enforcement heads are appointed directly, even at lower levels, now appointed directly by the president with just a consultation. They've consolidated the state council, which is sort of a quasi body that's not official, but this makes it official. It reports basically to Putin as an advisory group that's his cronies basically. And, just so Putin doesn't always have to tell everyone what to do, they've made it that the Constitutional Court can check laws adopted by the parliament before the president even has to sign them. So in the US, if you think about it, Congress passes a law, the president can veto it or not, and after that, the Supreme Court, upon a case withstanding, will determine the constitutionality. In the Russian system now, the parliament passes a law, the president can ask the Supreme Court, which he picked, to say nullify that law, and he doesn't have to actually veto it. Again, pretty much consolidating power. And the teasers, so to try and entice people for this obvious power grab, they basically threw in some nice to haves. They made the minimum wage cannot be lower than the subsistence minimum, which is kind of not going to help because you can always have a minimum wage, but with inflation and the current inflationary status, the rubles, it's like, yeah, you can have a minimum wage, but you're not going to be able to buy anything with it. They're going to index pensions. Again, with inflation, I don't know how much that will help. They passed 2 amendments. One was a defense of marriage, where they defined marriage as only between a man and a woman. And they asserted that Russia's faith in God, sort of going back to the Orthodox Christianity hallmarks. Interestingly enough, a lot of the polling indicated that these teasers did not really incentivize people one way or another. There wasn't like a huge outcry. Yes, we need to define marriages between a man and a woman. For the most part, it fell along political lines. There was probably 78% voted yes, 20-something% voted no, and it generally fell with what you'd expect as Putin having 3/4 of the country basically under his thumb. So new constitution for Russia, but kind of a continuing of a trend of this consolidation. Mick, that's great that you work for the federal government and you work for the Department of Treasury, and they sent you home and barred us from returning to any federal buildings. So yes, those folks are taking it seriously. I work for the Department of Defense, and they are borrowing people from military bases and are requiring masks. But the acts of an individual federal agency do not equate to nationwide acts of the federal government. And I would say that if the federal government at the executive level showed the same discipline and care as the cabinet secretaries did in protecting their agencies, we'd have a lot different outcome here. So I think the seriousness you're seeing comes at a level below the White House and probably below OMB. It's coming from the individual headquarters and the civil staff working with the civilian appointees to do that. So yeah, the DOD is taking this far more seriously than the White House. I think that's a fair thing to say, but that doesn't alleviate the seriousness you're seeing is not an alleviation of the abandonment of the sort of the duties of the president to have a plan to give guidance at every chance. And this isn't one way or another. At every chance he's had to make a choice or implement a policy, Trump hasn't said worse or better or not. He's just avoided the decision, so that I think part of it is a motivation is he doesn't want the blame. If it goes bad, he doesn't want the blame. So he's deferred it to the states. And that confusion, well, I'll show you, you know what? We're going to have some charts here that actually show it's not really the state openings and closings that have caused much of the economic harm. It's the people's loss of faith in being protected from COVID. So I think, you know, regardless of what's happening at the highest levels, people are not unaware of the risks of this. I mean, there's some fringe groups, obviously, and there's some debates up on masks, but I'll get to that when we get to the domestic policy. I know we're having a good discussion on domestics, but I have these international ones I want to get through because some of our listeners like the international. So from Russia, with love, James Bond call out. For anyone who likes James Bond anymore, I haven't watched it in 15 years. From Russia with love over to the South Chinese Sea. So what's going on in the South Chinese Sea? So a couple people are nervous about it because you've got two navies partying in the area, the China Navy and the US Navy. And what I've put up here is the map. So for those who don't understand, I'm going to give a very much crash course context of the South Chinese Sea territorial disputes. Very brief. This is a very complicated subject. I could do an entire hour and a half on this, and I may if people are interested. But basically what you have is international law says you get so many miles at 3 different zones, which demark from your coast, your island, your land that you own, different types of territorial boundaries that have different international laws applying. And what you see here is the South Chinese Sea. So to orient, you've got China up top here. Here's Hong Kong, Taiwan. You've got the Philippines over on the right. You have Brunei and Indonesia. Vietnam's down here as well. Or excuse me, Vietnam's over here. And all of these countries, right, the projection of those distances, if you map out those distances, they start to get very close to a lot of oil and natural gas that is in this area. So what's happened is China has created artificial islands. You see them here in the Paracel and the Spratly and some of these other ones. What they do is they basically go to an atoll or something that's near the surface and they dump a bunch of rocks in, they pile up some sand, and they get like a little minimum. I mean, some of these things have been built up now that they can have a little base on it or something like that. But these are man-made islands that are constructed solely for the purpose of saying, hey, look, we've got an island, that's our land, therefore our border now extends further out. And you can see how this claimed border of China, and this is what their claim is on the red line, cuts through a whole host of other international borders. And it's because they've created all of these sort of man-made isles in the South China Sea. Now, this has been going on. This isn't a Trump-only thing. This thing has been going on for 10 years now with the struggle. And I think, you know, there was always an attempt to pivot our concern from sort of the global war on terror to a focus on China, especially around the South China Sea. No president has really been able to do that as much, but that doesn't mean the problem wasn't ever growing or serious. It's continued to grow as they build these islands. And what you see right now is that China, to sort of assert its territorial rights, it has a very aggressive policy. If you're a fishing ship, a Vietnamese fishing ship, and you go in the wrong area, even though it's your territory and you can fish there, you'll be confronted by the Chinese Navy. Your boat may be rammed, it may be sideswiped, it may get close. The aircraft, Chinese aircraft, again, this is something militaries play with each other. They kind of do the dueling games of chicken where they try and intercede in airspace and provoke a response. China's been doing that a lot in all of those different countries. And this is, Vietnam is a communist country. It's been a little bit, they've introduced some market reforms, but they're not with China on this. They are very much opposed to China right now because it's all about this oil, natural gas, and fish resources that all the countries sort of want to have. And so this reached a head in 2016 where it finally got, like I said, this has been going on for a long time. In 2016, an international court ruled that China had no legal basis for their claims of sovereignty over the South China Sea. They basically pointed out that their 9 dash line claims, these are the claims they made around those manufactured islands, they're not recognized under international law. And China, of course, said, well, we'll abide by that, and thoughtfully reflected on. No, they didn't. They just continued doing what they're doing. And what's happened recently is I predicted, everyone was wondering what was going to happen with COVID-19 and state actor actions. I predicted Russia would be underwater on this and struggle. And if anyone were going to do anything, it'd be China, because they used their People's War to sort of brutally close down and shut down the pandemic. And you can argue around the margins, but they're COVID-19, they're largely past it for the most part. And now China's been pushing in all directions. They're pushing in India, testing the territorial boundaries there. They're pushing in Hong Kong with the national security law last week. They're pushing against Taiwan. And they just began pushing in the South China Sea by deploying their Navy for a series of exercises up around those Paracel Islands. Now, this was met with a counter drill by the U.S. Navy. 2 U.S. Aircraft carriers are being sent in the region. It's not being disclosed where they are, but they're operating in the South China Sea. And you now have this kind of dance of the sugar plum nuclear armed ferries that are in proximity to each other. Now, this is not, again, people always say, oh, this is World War III. It's not World War III yet. This is a well-orchestrated dance of positioning, one-upsmanship, brinksmanship. China has responded saying they're willing to have talks. They're always willing to have talks. They don't really do much. The U.S. is showing its muscle to say, we're going to commit to this region, which I think is kind of important, because as China pushes in all these directions, it's the same strategy Putin employed for a long time before he got bushwhacked by COVID and sort of Turkey, which is he would simply push until someone told him to stop. And if no one told him to stop, he'd keep pushing. And that's how Russia got expanded into all these different regions, Syria, Libya. Now Turkey is pushing back on Russia and pushing back pretty hard, and Russia is being stopped. China is doing the same large strategy of pushing and seeing where people raise an issue. And I think the U.S. responded appropriately with a military action to say, no, the South China Sea is not just going to be something you can get for claiming it. We're going to dispute that. So yes, there's a high amount of risk. You got 2 nuclear armed countries. You have carrier groups, and not touching each other, but they're in close proximity from a standpoint of the size of the sea. It could be risky, but I have a feeling this is being very carefully orchestrated to basically show face and show commitment without necessarily risking a war. But it is something to keep an eye on, because whenever you've got navies in close proximities, we've had air collisions when they play this game of chicken. A plane runs into another plane, both drop down. That happened right at the beginning of Bush's tenure in 2000 with China. You may have ships colliding. There's been some incidents in the Black Sea with Russia and U.S. navies where you have really close near misses or a partial hit. So it's something to keep an eye on. But wanted to go through and check, are there any questions on international stuff I've covered, or can we go to kind of a domestic economic front? Okay, so if you have questions on the international, ask them. I'm going to have a hard stop at 2 or 2:10, but I want to get to some of the domestic things, especially with the economy. So one of the things that has come up in the past several times is this concept of did we, and this was something Kevin Lane, I don't know if you're on, Kevin, right now. I'm not calling you out because it was a good question, but did we overreact in shutting down the states when we closed them and therefore tanked our economy? And this is the underlying question. I don't think it's an invalid question at all. I'm not one of these folks who's like, you can't talk about the economy when there's a pandemic. Remember, my point of view is that the economy is people and people are the economy. They're integrated. You can't separate them out and prioritize one over the other because they're essentially the same. But the question has come up both in the United States and in some countries like Sweden that is testing this induced herd immunity is, well, should we have a lesser response from a government standpoint, because that will help the economy? And I've got some good data now for the US to talk about that, and some just recently released one on Sweden to show kind of some of that gives some more context to that. And I think it makes it pretty clear that states opening and closing do not drive the economy. It's confidence in the COVID-19 response. So this is a chart I'll be using here. These lines, you'll see we've got some high frequency indicator, and you're going to see these lines, and they go in this order, and I'll call out the dates because they're marked on the timelines. But the green one is the week of that ended March 14th. This is what I call the market reaction. This is the week, if you remember, that had the stock market drop by a third. President Trump had his White House national address on Wednesday night that didn't go over very well. The NBA canceled its game, Coachella canceled, all the concerts canceled, the travel ban was, all of these things happened simultaneously in that week after building up. And this was before most states closed. And what I'm going to show is that the economic high frequency indicators, a high frequency indicator is something that's reported every couple of days. So it's very sensitive. I think we'll see that a lot of the drop down in economic activity happened before state closing, because the next four lines track the percent of states closed. So the solid one is 10% of states closed. That's New York, California, Washington. 50% closed, 72% closed, and 86% closed. That number's a little weird because some states never closed. And then as you go along the timeline, they begin reopening. 10% states have reopened, 20% states have reopened, 100% of states have reopened. And now, as of July 7th, some are pausing or reversing the reopen. So what you'll see in these timelines here, and we'll just go through a couple here. Oops, that is a, there we go. So we'll start with, let's see here. It's not letting me change. Okay, let me reshare that. It doesn't look like it's letting me change. Pause for technical difficulties. All right, that didn't work. We'll do it. We'll do it one at a time here to show. All right, here is, so the first one we're going to look at is restaurants, right? This high frequency indicator, restaurant data, year-on-year change in diners from online phone walk-in reservations. All this information comes from calculated risk. And to clear the chart, you have a decline year-over-year change or decline. So at 100% down year-over-year, that means no business, right? And here's the timeline at the bottom. And these are the Texas, New York, Georgia, Florida, California, and the entire United States. And again, these lines are added now so that you can take a look at when did the actual economic decline happen in restaurants in this case. So here is that week I talked about, that hell week that ended March 14th. This first line is when 10% of the states, look at the decline from when the market began reaction to just New York, California, and Washington being closed. Now we can say, well, New York and California, if they're closing, that makes sense, they're dropping. But Texas, Florida, Georgia, the entire United States, everything is dropping like a rock. Only 10% of the states are closed. By 20% of the states being closed, restaurants are done, right? Before there's even a lockdown order in most states, people had decided not to engage in the economy and had sort of self-opted out. And you can see here that, yes, by 86% of the states are closed. It's already been closed for a while. Likewise, as we begin reopening, you see the restaurant business pick up. So this is 10% open, 20% open. This is when 100% of the states were reopened in some form or another. And you see the restaurant business is picking up. But look what happens over here. You start to see this decline. This is as the realization that the outbreak is not being contained becomes aware. States haven't paused or reversed the reopenings. This is right now, this brown line, that indicates when the states began pausing or reversing the reopenings. Again, the market reacted before the state's official actions happen. And this is something that we're going to see again and again, be a couple looks. Right now, this is TSA checkpoint. Again, high frequency indicator. This indicates amount of air travel. And you can see here, total number of travelers that are going through TSA security by timeline as states close. Now, you could argue that there was a travel ban in Europe put in place right at this green line. So that dropped it a lot. But there was also a lot of interstate travel dropped off as well. Much of the travel in the United States is interstate. And again, you see the state closings, travel had already bottomed out well before the maximum limit of states. And as it's reopened, there's been this gradual choppy increase. We'll see if there's any decline in travel based off these reopening problems when they're having the pandemic flare out. This is, we'll go to here. This is gasoline consumption year over year. So this is a proxy of motor travel by car. You can see here the change in percent. Again, from the market going down, it dropped 40% by the time only 20% of the states were closed. So people are already opting off the roads while states are still open, businesses are still open. By the time actually all the states have opened, we're beginning to see a return of motor travel. And remember, this is the time when the Russian and Saudi Arabian oil war is going on, and gas is super cheap. Gas is down to $1.40, $1.50 in many places. And so you're starting to see this increase. And you have a large increase, obviously, around Memorial Day as the states reopen. And you're seeing this here now. It may be, as we see the July 4th weekend, you may see another bump here coming up, but it'll be interesting to see whether this peak here and the slight decline marks the start of a decline from the market before states pause and reverse openings. And this is transit. So not everyone drives cars. This is public transit, right? Obviously, very concerning if you're thinking about public transit and the COVID. Again, you see this large drop off across not just select areas that we're introducing it, but across the entire United States, really drop off even before states. What these show is that people are opting out of risking themselves if they can in the economy. And that's kind of the large concept here is of trying to say, well, were the state closings too severe or less severe? I'd say it was the confidence in the pandemic response. And you can see the confidence was very low. It dropped in all of those. And because of the technical difficulties in time, I'm not going to go through the rest of the charts. I'll try and figure that out. But if you go to calculated risk on the link, they have all these high frequency charts. There's about 6 of them. And what it shows is that the economy, once that confidence was lost, the economy stopped itself well before states' closures stopped the economy legally. The economy shut itself down. And what's going to be interesting is the economy has begun acting back up or open as these state reopenings, but is it going to shut it down self again over fear of the uncontrolled outbreaks? That's going to be something we're going to have to see. And there's another example. If we talk about Sweden, when we talk about economic impacts and closing, Sweden's an interesting case study. It's going to be, there's so much coming out of this pandemic that's going to be, graduate students for years are going to have plenty of research to do, because Sweden alone, of just about every OECD country and state, chose an induced herd immunity approach and has pretty much stuck with it. Now, Britain, Belgium, the Netherlands, I think a couple others, Italy, or no, wasn't it? There's been a few who have tried induced herd immunity, but they all abandoned it. Sweden stuck with it. And what that means is they're largely staying open. They're largely letting people continue to go to restaurants, continue to go to bars. They're trying to protect the elderly, trying being the key word. And they're trying to say, look, we'll build up a herd immunity in the younger population. And we've talked at length in the Info Mullet from the science of whether that's a good idea or not. It's generally considered not a good idea. But one of the reasons they did this was that, well, from an economic standpoint, by avoiding closures, we're going to avoid the economic pain and have less economic severe consequences. And we now have information coming out of how that's gone. So first of all, on the health and safety side of the equation, the induced herd immunity approach has not kept Sweden from having a horrible outcome from a health standpoint. So, I've showed before its Baltic neighbors, Norway, Finland, Denmark. Sweden was red on that map. Their per capita death rate, if you adjust for population, is actually 40% more than the United States per capita. And it's a much smaller population, so it's only like 6,000 deaths, but it's a population of 10 million or something like that. Compared to their neighbors, like their per capita death rate is 12 times higher than Norway, 7 times higher than Finland, and 6 times higher than Denmark. So from a health standpoint, so far at least, their induced herd immunity has completely failed to do what it set out to do, which was to protect the elderly population, because I think over half of those deaths are in the elderly population. Now, there's an argument that this will all pay off in wave 2 down the road. It's a really dangerous hypothetical, and we've gone into the reasons that's probably not good science. But the other part of this equation is, well, how is their economy doing? Well, not well. See, the Swedish people, even though they had the ability to go to foods and bars and restaurants, pulled back domestic consumption quite a bit. Not enough to prevent the outbreak from continuing and spreading like wildfire, which is what they're dealing with now, but enough to have their economy contract. Plus, Sweden's not an island, metaphorically speaking, the economic sense. It depends on exports and imports from other countries that themselves are going through the pandemic. So overall, Sweden's had an economic contraction of about 4.5% and an unemployment rate that's at about 9%. Well, let's compare these to their near neighbors. So they're at a 4.5% contraction. And 9% unemployment. Denmark, which is right across from the Baltic bordering Germany, their contraction is expected to be 4.1%. So about the same. Let's call it even and say it's roughly the same economic contraction. But the death rate in Sweden is 6 times higher than Denmark. And unemployment in Denmark's only 5.6. So better unemployment picture. Norway, which was really did the hammer and dance, was very aggressive in doing it, and sort of shifted into the dance phase so they could reopen. They're only expected to have a contracted economy of 3.9%, so under 4%. And so they're actually, this is down from about 5.5. So they're looking like they're having that V-shaped recovery because they've been able to execute the hammer and the dance. Their economy's open, they're able to mitigate the harm, and they were, Sweden had 12 times the death rate of Norway. So again, on these calculations of whether it was a good idea or not, we've talked about the science. We don't think it's a good idea from the science, but from pure economic standpoint, it doesn't look like it worked out very well for Sweden either to do that. So I'll check pause here to see if there's any questions. Again, bit of an international flavor, but I wanted to cover some of the international discussions going on. Any questions or comments? Let me go back through here and see if there's any questions. Ed Cook asked, are we seeing international pushback to the U.S. buying up all the remdesivir stocks for 3 months, leaving countries like the Nubia 7 out in the cold? I think, Ed, good question. The pushback is not going to come from the Nubia 7. They do not have the economic leverage to really make an effective pushback. I mean, you're talking Nigeria, Ukraine, Bangladesh, Brazil, India. I mean, President Bolsonaro has the personal relationship with Trump to cut a deal, but he doesn't think the pandemic's a big deal. So I'm not seeing that happening. I think the pushback from the remdesivir buy-up is going to come from those countries that have economic clout and a stake to saying, hey, we can afford this, we want to buy it, want to do it, and try and get an allocation system worked up. Someone said they'd rather travel to Libya right now than the U.S. I just want to be clear, not a good idea. I would not. There was an airstrike in Libya. We talked about the Libya situation with Egypt threatening to do attack. There was an airstrike in Libya that destroyed some of Turkish air defense systems. They don't know who did it. It could have been General Haftar's forces, kind of unlikely. It could have been Egypt, or it could have been France. Yeah, don't go to Libya. There's plenty of other green countries out there that are, just because it was green on the coronavirus map, don't think that means it's green across the board. Like let's not get out of line here. Other questions? Yeah, some of these longer questions, I can't read the entire paragraph in the middle of the thing. So if you still haven't yet considered become a Patreon sponsor, www.patreon.com/infomullet, $5 a month for Patreon sponsors. We appreciate all that. I got to remember that. I'm not that good at it. But also check out our YouTube channel and subscribe to that. Yeah, Ed's talking, we're talking about this heat comment and indoor air recirculation. I think most of the spread is indoors. I mean, there's obviously spread outdoors, but it diffuses a lot outdoors. And if you think about this cloud effect of accumulation, the more people that are inside trying to get some of that AC, there's also a higher risk. But again, I think the biggest risk is going to be the state reopenings. That's the highest one, is that it spreads it around.
Barbara's asking, I had an email back from the CDC that said if state, local, or tribal health departments report probable deaths and probable case to them, they are counted in their totals. If they don't report these probable cases, then it's marked NA in their tables. If these probable cases are found to be negative, they are not taken out of their tables. I feel like I didn't understand this. I've read their email several times. I can't answer. I try not to get into like, hey, analyze this document you don't have it in front of them. I haven't seen the email. I don't know it. On a general sense, states are allowed to set the rules on how they are reporting that case, and they're allowed to set the procedures by which they say whether something was a coronavirus death or not. This has led to some states saying if you don't have a positive coronavirus test, even though by all circumstances we suspect it as being COVID-19, it's not reported as a COVID death. Other states are saying if it looks, walks, and quacks like a COVID case, it's a COVID death. And this has led to some variation. I think it's probably, if anything, being undercounted rather than overcounted. I haven't heard about the negatives not being taken out. I think the bigger risk is that states that simply aren't testing people for coronavirus and saying, don't report that. That means if you died in your home, a nursing home, somewhere there, the test was prioritized for someone who's alive then, those deaths probably aren't being counted. Again, ballpark wise across all these permutations, I think our deaths are probably from somewhere 10 to 15% undercounted. I'm not going to go out there and say that our deaths are 3 or 4 times higher than they should be or higher than they are being reported. I think it's probably a 15%. Occasionally you see individual states will go back and sort of scrub their books and you'll see a pop up in the deaths. New Jersey did this last, I think 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago, where all of a sudden there were 2,000 deaths in a day. And you look into that and they're all coming from New Jersey, where they go back over a period of months and they scrub it and they sort of update those totals. I think you'll be seeing more of those states doing it, but there was 900 deaths yesterday. So we've been at that low 300, 400, but it's been inching back up. And the 900 deaths yesterday, it's really hard with this weekend effect. Is that because there was a backlog of deaths over the weekend that they just now got to because it was a holiday weekend? I don't know, but keep an eye out. If that death rate stays close to 1,000, that's right back where we were for most of April and May, and that's a very bad sign. Let me look at more questions here. It'll be interesting what the new stimulus checks the government will be giving out. They seem focused around taking vacations a certain distance. I don't know what that means, Tyler. I don't understand that. Trisha's asking about school reopenings. Very good question. I want to tackle that next week because it gets into both universities and school districts. I'm going to tackle that next week. Joe's asking about, he's relaying his daughter lives in Nicaragua, reports that the government has their head in the sand, but a lot more self-governance and precaution than we see in Middle America. Have you heard of other nation citizens stepping up? Joe, there's no formal study on this. And again, I get away from sort of national characteristics ascribed to virtue, but there seems to be a trend from areas which are sort of used to being on their own, where they don't have a strong healthcare system to fall back on, being more successful at taking this seriously. And this could be a government or citizens, to the extent they can, taking it seriously, being proactive, because they know that support network's not in place. And one of the examples of this is you can divide East and West Europe pretty much down along the German line. In Western Europe, their healthcare systems are much more robust. They fared a lot worse. And some of the suspicion is that Eastern European countries, knowing they didn't have a good healthcare system, were much more aggressive early on. Same situation in a lot of these countries in Africa that are green, around Nigeria and the Central Boreal region, is that they deal with pandemics on a much more regular basis. Cholera, Ebola, different forms of infectious diseases, and they know it's bad. They have more practical experience. They don't have the fancy vaccines and sophisticated treatments to fall back on. They've got to handle it on the ground level, and that has equipped them to do what is necessary to stop this. I think it's not universal, though. You can find some areas where there's very much mixed opinions, and people aren't necessarily able to step up or aren't stepping as much as either. Tyler, I'm going to look into that to see, because I didn't think Congress has passed anything yet. So what Tyler's discussing, and this is a good point, he's talking about the first stimulus check, and the next round might have a rider or provision on it tied to vacations or tourism, which is sort of sounds like some lobbyist or some Congress critter who wants tourism is trying to spark up travel. That does sound like a bad idea, but my understanding is Congress is nowhere close to passing that next round of relief. So Tyler, I'm going to look into that for next week and have an update on where we're at for that next round of relief law, because I know the hospitals are looking for something in that as well. And so we're at the top of the hour, and I gotta close it. We'll look at school reopenings and a second round relief for private citizens next week. So I want to shut it down because I'm at about close to 2:10. Thank you everyone for being here today. Thanks for all the great discussion. Hopefully the international updates were helpful, useful. Again, I try and make a balance. I know it's COVID, but there's other stuff happening in the world, and I'm trying to get that. So if you have an international situation you want to see discussed, pop it up in one of these chats, send it to me on a message. I'll try and get it worked in. Again, stay inside if you can. If you can't, wear a mask, be safe, and everyone take care of themselves. Have a good day. Take care. Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support.